Hello, friends. Welcome back to ABN's Trinity channel for another episode of Colliding Worldviews. Today is Monday, January 29th, in the year of our Lord, 2018. And it's a blessing, as always, to have so many people tuning in from around the world via satellite, high-speed internet, and, of course, all of the internet-based devices such as Amazon Fire Stick, Roku, Apple TV. The list goes on and on. Just go to trinitychannel.com/platforms, and you can see all the different ways that you can watch this show live, as well as all the other live weekly shows on that you can tune into and see every single week. Also, our first International Apologetics Marathon of 2018 is going to be happening June 4th through 8th, the first full week in June. Many great guests and topic, as usual, are being booked for that. So we hope that you continue to spread the word about the Trinity channel. All the shows that you can see here live every week, including this one, Colliding Worldviews. If this is your first time here, we do topics on Islam about 60-70% of the time, but we do many other topics as well. You can find all the past shows just by going to the Trinity channel's YouTube channel or my Vimeo channel, vimeo.com/Tony Goulet. You can see all the past episodes of Colliding Worldviews, as well as the other weekly shows that I do. Today, here on Colliding Worldviews, the topic is the Middle East and Islamism in perspective. And this is a very vital topic, as I've said before. Even on last Friday's Islam in the News, I said that, you see the jihadists out there, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groups. Yes, they're dangerous because they're carrying weapons. But number one, they're really a distraction from what's happening behind the scenes. And number two, at the end of the day, I think that the political Islamists are actually more dangerous than the jihadists. Yes, the jihadists are carrying weapons, so at face value, they're very dangerous. But it's the Islamists, the political Islamists, who are working behind the scenes, who are wearing suits rather than carrying weapons. And they are working very hard, if not harder than the jihadists, to Islamize the West, make Islam acceptable in the West. And today, my guest is going to be talking about this and what is happening. My guest today is Sam Westrop. He is the director of Islamist Watch, which is a project of the Middle East Forum. Many of our viewers may be familiar with the Middle East Forum. That's meforum.org. Sam's website is islamist-watch.org. We will have both websites on the bottom of our screen. Sam Westrop has headed Islamist Watch since March of 2017, when the Middle East Forum absorbed the Counter-Extremism Unit of Americans for Peace and Tolerance, or APT. Prior to this, he was research director at APT, where he excelled at tracking Islamist activity across New England and ran Stand for Peace, a London-based counter-extremism organization monitoring Islamists throughout the United Kingdom. Mr. Westrop is a senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute, and his writings have appeared at such publications as National Review, National Post, and The Hill. And he's appeared on dozens of television and radio stations, including BBC, Al Jazeera, Newsmax, and now ABN's Trinity channel. So we want to welcome him to the show today. Sam, welcome to the Trinity channel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here, Sam, because many of our viewers are familiar with Islam. They are familiar with the agenda that's taking place, that's being implemented here in the West. And of course, the UK and America both fall into that West territory. What is the mission and focus of the Middle East Forum, and how has it shifted over the years?
Well, the Middle East Forum protects and supports American interests. It does this through three different ways. Firstly, intellectually. We research, we produce policy ideas, we lobby for policies and actions that we think protect American interests, both domestically and with regards to the Middle East. Secondly, we act in an activism sense. Through projects like my own, Islamist Watch, we challenge extremism. Our Campus Watch program looks at Middle East studies to ensure that the Middle East is taught without bias. Our Washington project looks at what's happening in Washington and makes effort to connect with politicians there. Thirdly, we operate through financially, philanthropically. We give money, we distribute grants to organizations and individuals who share our beliefs, who share our mission across the world.
Excellent. And the Middle East Forum has definitely been around longer than Islamist Watch or Islamist Watch. And that is the latter is the one that you direct. And again, we want to point people to both websites to check out because there's great content every single week that is posted on each of them. But tell us about Islamist Watch in particular. What do you do there, and how has that project changed since it began?
Sure. So Islamist Watch began in the mid-2000s. It was set up as a number of people, including Dr. Pipes, the president and founder of the Middle East Forum, noticed the dangerous increase in non-violent or lawful Islamism in the United States. Islamist Watch was set up to document that. In fact, we only deal with lawful Islamism, not violent Islamism, not jihadi activity. We look at the lawful Islamists who exploit Western institutions and ideas to further their agenda. We look at those who would misuse or exploit or take advantage of the liberal democratic ideas on which the West flourishes and use that against us. So that's what Islamist Watch does. Now, for the last 12 years of its existence, that mission has changed a little bit, but the fundamental idea remains the same, because the majority of politicians and journalists in America do not understand the danger posed by non-violent or lawful Islamism. The only Islamism they accept exists is that of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, whereas our argument is that they are merely a symptom of a much wider problem, and that you are going to face generations of hate and violence and an existential threat unless you tackle the problem of extremists working within our own borders, using our own laws, and exploiting our own institutions.
And these are two very important distinctions for people to know, Sam, because a ton of people in the West haven't studied Islam. They haven't studied the life of Muhammad. So they don't realize that the actions of ISIS line up more with the life of Muhammad than, of course, your average American Muslim neighbor, coworker, friend, classmate, etc. So people do need to know about that. But at the same time, even though, yes, jihadism and anyone who follows the life of Muhammad, which commonly happens when a Muslim really truly believes that Muhammad's the perfect man and the perfect Muslim, which is the orthodox teaching about him. But people need to know that this distinction between that and the Islamists or Islamists who are in the West, we don't see this happening in the Middle East in countries that are already under Sharia. We see the Islamists working in the West, countries that they want to Islamize, and the tactics that they use, of course, the method of operation doesn't cause them to wind up on the nightly news like the jihadists who are out there carrying weapons. But if we study the Muslim Brotherhood and the life of Hassan al-Banna and Said Qutb and the different men who started this modernization, but not westernization, still wanting the world to be under Sharia and really having the same end goal as the jihadists, wanting a worldwide caliphate, but again, guys wearing suits rather than carrying weapons. If people don't know the distinctions between these two, and that they're both a threat to the West, people are going to stay ignorant. People are going to continue to talk past one another because they don't realize the threat of both. And how prevalent is the extremist rhetoric in the United States?
Well, I think another way to phrase that question is, within Muslim communities, how prevalent are the Islamists? If you take your average mosque, if you take a community center, a private Islamic school, how many of them are run by Islamists? That's very difficult to know, very difficult to work out. However, what we do know is that it's too many. We look at too many mosques in the United States and see extremists on their boards. We see extremists running clerical bodies. We see the community centers being run by extremists. We know that those few moderate Muslims out there who struggle against the extremists increasingly find themselves without a home, without an institution from which to work. There are too many. It is highly prevalent. Unfortunately, you can look at most major cities in the US, almost any city in the US at the mosque, and find an extremist preacher speaking at least once a week from some pulpit somewhere. And the failure of mainstream media to recognize this danger, to recognize the seriousness of this problem, the extent of this problem, means that these extremists do all the better for it. There is no one really to challenge them. So part of Islamist Watch's job is trying to identify this pattern, trying to work out how many there are, what particular sects within Islam and within Islamism these extremists belong to, and empowering moderate Muslims to fight back and educating the polity, the media, the journalists, the civil servants, to also understand that when they meet with the extremist cleric who runs the local mosque, he is not necessarily representative of all Islam in America, or indeed even a local community. He belongs to a specific extremist sect that believes specific extremist ideas. It's a tough battle, and there's a lot of different Islamist groups that work in America, more so than I think most people realize, even those more tuned into this discussion. And really, there is a mountain of work in front of us that we need all the help we can in trying to overcome.
Now, as a follow-up question to that, I've talked a lot about this in the past, Sam, where I talk about the term radical, how that is used in the West commonly to talk about an aberration of Islam. People say, oh yeah, ISIS, oh no, they're radical or whatever else. But the definition of radical simply means to go back to the root. So whereas a radical Christian just simply does what Jesus said to do, what he told his followers to do, a radical Muslim does what Muhammad said to do. So it kind of has a negative connotation to the word radical if you don't know the actual definition of it. It's simply just to go back to the root of the system itself. So we need to do that same thing with the term extremist, and that word is also defined differently in the West than it is by Islam. When you guys talk about extremism or extremists at Middle East Forum and Islamist Watch, in what sense, the Western sense, the Eastern sense, or maybe another way, I'm not sure, how do you guys define that? And please explain that to our audience.
Sure. So extremism, as you rightly pointed out, is a nebulous term. It could mean so many different things. And in fact, in Europe, this is a common problem among government counter-extremism programs, because they announce these big taxpayer-funded programs which involve supposedly halting radicalization problems within the country, and they put laws on the statute books dictating that counter-extremism must be carried out. And then someone asks, well, who is an extremist and what is extremism? And the government can never quite define it. The whole debate around Islamism suffers from a problem with terminology. We've never really found good words to describe the problem at hand. We've always struggled to define what separates an Islamist non-violent extremist from a violent Islamist extremist. We suffer from the intense confusion, and even if you look at the media, the groups they choose sometimes to refer to as Islamist, and sometimes they simply refer to as orthodox or conservative. It varies immensely not just between different countries, but between different publications. There is no unanimous agreement on what extremism is, on what Islamism is. It's a complicated subject. That said, Islamist Watch takes a fairly simple view to what we think an extremist is, and that's someone who incites hatred or violence against another group of people. In the case of Islamism, the thing that unites the jihadists in the Middle East with a cleric at an extremist mosque in downtown New York would be they're both inciting hatred against the West. Now, one of them may say, well, go blow them up. The other may say, well, just hate them and work against them, use their laws and their institutions against them. But the end goal is ultimately the same, destruction of the West and the imposition of Islam. That's how we define extremist in this context, and that's how we define Islamism in this context.
And this is something that's very important for people here, especially in the West, to know, because this is definitely a case of colliding worldviews. That's why this is a very important show that we're doing today. Just for a quick example, think about Saudi Arabia, where they regularly have beheadings for crimes where in the United States or in the West, that would beheading would not be the punishment in any way for any reason, but here in the West, we would say, oh, yeah, that's extreme. You're beheading people for this crime. That is extreme. Where if you grew up in Saudi Arabia and you lived there your entire life and that that would be normal. It wouldn't be extremist, quote unquote. So for a person who grew up there to define the term extremist, it would be interesting to hear their definition of the term compared to the West. And that's why it's so important for us to always define our terms, because if not, we continue to talk past one another. This is just something else that people in the West need to get informed about. Now, every single week on Islam in the News, it seems like I'm presenting at least one news story, if not more, on ISIS and keeping up to what's happening with them, how they've lost territory, how people have died, different countries have been fighting them, and all that kind of stuff. We've heard from different sources that ISIS is done away with. At the same time, I've presented some more news stories saying, hey, yes, their numbers are very low. They're not nearly as high as they used to be. They don't have nearly as much territory as they used to have at one time, but they're still there. They're just moving. There's talk about them moving into different parts of Syria, and I think northwestern Syria, I believe. What is the most up-to-date status of ISIS, and do we still need to be concerned about that group?
Yes, we do need to be concerned about ISIS. It certainly has lost a lot over the last year or so. ISIS, I believe the latest figure is 95% of its territory is now gone. It's lost hundreds of its leaders, thousands of its fighters. The last briefing I saw claimed that it only has between 1,000 and 3,000 fighters on the ground presently, although who knows how accurate that is. That said, despite their dwindling numbers, their dwindling land, we've made this mistake before to assume that, from decimating or even wiping out 95% of an organization means the end of that organization. Let us remember the predecessor to ISIS, its original name and group was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And the coalition forces and the Iraqi government were fairly convinced they'd wiped them out back over 10 years ago now. That obviously wasn't true, because Al-Qaeda in Iraq became the Islamic State. So groups can enjoy a resurgence, certainly. But more importantly is that, as I mentioned before, groups like ISIS are a symptom. So even if you wipe out every single ISIS fighter and leader, the infrastructure that supports them, the ideas that underpin them, still exist in far too great a number. So that the clerics in the Middle East who support ISIS from their pulpit, they still exist. The financial supporters from Qatar to Saudi to places even like Turkey, they still exist. The recruits for ISIS that come from everywhere from North London to Minnesota, if they're not joining ISIS, they're joining Al-Shabaab, they're joining Al-Qaeda, they're going to Yemen to join jihadist group there. ISIS, as I say, is a symptom. Defeating ISIS means very little. It simply means we've tackled one small symptom of a much wider disease. And until we tackle the root cause, Islamist ideology, which grows not just in the Middle East, but in communities throughout the West, only then can we say we've defeated ISIS and defeated radical Islam. And that day is a very long way off.
And this is very important information for people to have, because a lot of people, especially in the West, have heard this common claim, oh, ISIS, they're not Islamic because they're killing Muslims. Well, number one, you're begging the question because you're assuming that they're Muslims. ISIS would say, well, no, they're not. That's why we're killing them. The Quran only talks about killing kafirs, killing polytheists, but it talks about killing hypocrites as well. And ISIS would consider certain Muslims who aren't doing what they're doing hypocrites. And if you take ISIS completely out of the equation, I mean, Sunnis and Shias have been killing each other for 1,400 years. So just because one person who calls himself a Muslim kills another person who calls himself a Muslim doesn't mean in any way that you're not Islamic. And this is a ridiculous claim for ISIS. But like you said, Sam, they are just one particular group who happens to have this ideology. As long as the ideology still exists, well, we're going to just face the problem again with another group with a different name. And that is why these definitely are colliding worldviews, and worldviews don't collide if everyone has the same worldview. But of course, that isn't the case. We have people who do follow Muhammad's life to a T. They do what he said to do, and we see the fruit of that in ISIS and other jihadist groups. But again, just as important for people to know about, and even, like I said, perhaps even more dangerous than jihadists, who, of course, military can fight, are the people who are not carrying weapons, but are, again, wearing suits and still have this goal of the world being under Sharia and are working just as hard, if not harder, than the jihadists. The forum's Islamist Watch project has been exposing Islamists and their sympathizers for years. Now that online and domestic radicalization has become such a threat, how has your approach changed in the way that you are fighting this Islamism?
Well, I think there are two questions there. One, yes, the question of domestic extremism, domestic radicalization generally, and then two, the question of online extremism. So I will speak about online extremism for a second, because this is an area in which I certainly disagree with my colleagues in the field. I don't believe online radicalization is a thing. I believe it has been wildly exaggerated by governments because it's a way to blame someone else that's not them for the radicalization problem. They can point to the internet, they can point to YouTube, they can point to the social media giants and phantom Twitter accounts run thousands of miles away in the Middle East as the reason that young Muslim kids are wanting to pick up a gun or blow up a bus. There's very little evidence for this. The time after time reports show that the vast majority of jihadists have contact offline with extremists who radicalize them before they go on to commit violence. Those who may watch Anwar al-Awlaki video, some al-Qaeda video from the comfort of the computer in their bedroom, sure, they exist, but at some point they've been to the local mosque where they've heard an extremist speak, they've hung out with the wrong kind of Islamist crowd, they've got involved with someone offline. Extremists do their worst work offline. Online radicalization has very little evidence to back up that it is a driving force behind the radicalization problem. And I mentioned earlier that I think governments use this as an excuse. My own country, where I'm originally from, Britain, is a good example of this. The current Prime Minister, Theresa May, she used to be Home Secretary, she has spent the last 5-6 years claiming that the way to defeat extremism is to shut down, is to censor the internet, to shut down extremist Twitter accounts, to shut down extremist Facebook accounts and YouTube pages, and so on. So every year the government can say, look, we shut down 100,000 accounts and websites. Haven't we done a wonderful thing where we're stopping extremism from flourishing, we're stopping the problem of terrorism? Of course, they have absolutely no practical difference at all, because something like this is a Sisyphean task. You shut down one Twitter account, 40 more exist within a few minutes later. But it doesn't matter for the government, because it looks like they're doing something, because the fight against extremism and radicalization is so incredibly difficult. I'm not saying there's an easy solution, there's not, that they want something quantitative they can point to, some kind of quantitative result. So they speak to
and it seems that we're having some slight audio difficulties. Hopefully we can clear that all up. This is very important information for people to know about, because Sam, what you're talking about sounds, I mean, what people don't realize is pretty much just putting Band-Aids on stuff and not dealing with the underlying cause. It's like, you know, in countries where they have a lot of people doing this vehicular jihad, driving trucks or whatever else into crowds of people, and they just go and put up cement barriers. Like, okay, let's put a Band-Aid here and make it so that people can't drive off the road as easily. Well, you're not fixing the problem. You're not dealing with the ideology. You're just putting more and more hindrances in place, taking away the rights from law-abiding citizens than you are dealing with the ideology itself. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read it, Sam, but some of our viewers may have, some of our viewers may have never heard of it, but Ibn Warwick, who's well known by many people who are looking to the root of Islam, the history and all that stuff, his newest book is called The Islam in Islamic Terrorism. And the first chapter of that book is called The Root Cause Fallacy. And Ibn Warwick gives, I believe, probably 10 different reasons or excuses maybe that people use for the jihadism, the terrorism, and all of that takes place. One of them is talking about this claim that, oh, you know, they don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't have, you know, all this kind of stuff. Well, Osama bin Laden was very rich. It wasn't about money to him. It was about the ideology. And also, too, there are many other reasons that he lists in there. And this is something that people need to be aware of. All these different excuses that are being made, like you just said, you know, shutting down this Twitter account, shutting down that website, it's just putting a Band-Aid on it. It's not dealing with the ideology itself. Now, at the same time, we know that there are many Muslims in the West who don't have a jihadist, a terroristic, even an Islamist type of mindset. They just want to live their life. They just want to raise their kids. It's more precise to call them a cultural Muslim, or they're just a Muslim by tradition, that kind of thing. And there's another term that's used in the West and in the East, which again has a different definition, is that the term moderate. Now, Daniel Pipes, who founded the Middle East Forum in the 1990s, has long held that, quote, radical Islam is the problem, moderate Muslims are the solution. Do you agree with this, and how do you see moderates helping to defeat radical Islam, quote unquote?
Yes, I do agree with this. In fact, it is the mantra of Islamist Watch. Radical Islam is the problem, moderate Islam is the solution. And I don't just think this is a theory. This is something I've seen my entire life. I grew up in a fairly Muslim city in England. I grew up around Muslim friends. I've been to Muslim weddings. I've attended Muslim services, and I now work with the Muslim community to defeat the extremism in their midst. Moderate Islam exists because I know Muslims and have worked with Muslims who oppose Islamism. They oppose the extremists who have taken over their mosques. The reason you don't see as much of them as we would like is that they're shut out by the Islamists. They don't have their own institutions. They don't have their own clerical bodies. That's partly because because of a lack of money. They don't have oil-rich Middle Eastern states funding them. It's partly because a lack of legitimacy. Politicians continue to work with the Islamists and ignore the moderates. And it's partly because, and this is an important point that I would like to get into more, because Islam is so diverse and has so many hundreds of different sects, not just Sunni and Shia, but within Sunni and Shia, many dozens of competing sects, that no moderate Muslim can represent all those sects. Now, why the Islamists are so successful is that they've falsely convinced the West that they, the Islamists, represent all of Islam, all Muslims. So while the Islamists enjoy the benefit of legitimacy and funding from the West because we regard the Islamists as representative of Islam, the genuine moderates have nothing because they tell the truth. They say, well, I represent my local community. I represent this mosque and that school, and that's about it. The Islamists have won the PR war, and the moderate Muslims are suffering terribly, and those who speak out then face the threat of violence or intimidation. So we do need to help the moderate Muslims, because without the moderate Muslims, we can't defeat the Islamists, because the moderate Muslims prove that the Islamists exist. They prove that the Islamists are imposing a violent and extremist agenda over Western Islam. And moderate Muslims prove that there is a form of Islam that can assimilate and can work with the West and can be peaceful and oppose violence and extremism in all its forms. We need to work with moderate Muslims also because there's no other choice. If we don't work with them, then that's just an ally we won't have, and an even greater threat from the Islamists themselves.
And people need to realize this when they're talking with their Muslim neighbor, coworker, friend, classmate, etc. here in the West. Yes, there are many moderate Muslims in the world, and really they are the ones who need to have this ideological battle with the radicals, quote unquote, or the extremists or the political Islamists and all of that. Now, if Islam is defined by Muhammad and his life, and Christianity is defined by Jesus Christ and his life, then really those are the people that we need to look to overall for who defines the religion itself. Just like any Christian today may not do exactly what Jesus said to do, well, that's a different factor than what Jesus actually taught, and same thing with Muhammad. So I would say there is no moderate Islam, but there are moderate Muslims. Moderate Muslims, or any Muslim, whatever you want to call them, living today don't define Islam. Muhammad did 1,400 years ago. It's a good thing that many Muslims in the West and just around the world don't do what Muhammad said to do. And in that case, they are moderates compared to what he did. And that's a good thing. But that's something to think about, and we're going to come back and talk more about that and more questions that I have for Sam Westrop right after our commercial break. Stay right where you are, back in just a couple of minutes.
Now in the palm of your hand is the updated ABN SAD app, so you can now watch all the programs, shows, and channels in different languages. You can download the app in the App Store related to your device. Once downloaded, you will see 6 different categories within the ABN SAT app. The first category being the English category, which includes 18 different channels. The Arabic category includes 31 channels. The Worship category has 5 channels. The Discipleship category includes 5 channels as well. For more information, please call the numbers on your screen or visit our website at trinitychannel.com.
Thank you for watching Trinity Channel and supporting ABN SAT TV ministry. You can further support this ministry through social media, Facebook and YouTube. Just search Trinity Channel and click on our page. From there, like, follow, and share our page on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel while clicking on the bell icon to the right to receive notifications on new videos that we will post to the channel each week. Most importantly, after watching a video on these sites, use the comment section to give your thoughts about the program. Continue to support this ministry by following us on social media.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to ABN's Trinity Channel for Colliding Worldviews. Today, my guest is Sam Westrop, the director of Islamist Watch, which is a project of the Middle East Forum. It's so great to have him here today as we're talking about Islamists or Islamists in the West, in the UK, here in the US, and the threat that they have, the threat that they give the West, the threat that they are to the West, especially in distinction to the jihadists who are out there. We've been talking about a lot of different terms here before the break, and we were talking about the fact that there are many moderate Muslims throughout the world, making a distinction between the people and the religio-political system of Islam itself. Just as we see how they're Salafists, they of course have a different method of operation than the political Islamists. The Salafists, I mean, every Wahhabi who's named after Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who wasn't even born until 1703, is a Salafi, but not every Salafi is a Wahhabi. And to get the guys who are trying to just get back to the life of Muhammad and live that way in every single way that they can, and making a distinction between that and the guys today who are wearing suits, who have more of a mindset of Hassan al-Banna and Said Qutb, and the guys who founded the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt back in 1928. And the many front groups that they have here in the U.S., there's CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a front group of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we see in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood is attacking Coptic Christians all the time. They're very violent. And here in the U.S., it's not the case. Right now, they're really just working behind the scenes, building relationships with military officials, government officials, law enforcement officials, and all of that, trying to build relationships and make Islam palatable to the West and acceptable in the West. And Sam, you are working very hard letting people know about this. You guys focus on the political Islamism. And we thank God for you and for your work and all the articles that you guys put out. You just wrote an article for the National Review on how militant groups from South Asia are raising funds in the United States. What's going on, and how are these groups working under the radar?
Yes, that's right. So you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, you mentioned the Salafis and the Wahhabis. These are some of the most dangerous Islamist networks in the world, and active here in America as well. There are other Islamist movements, though, and one of them is called Jamaat al-Islami. It's often considered a cousin of the Muslim Brotherhood, and in fact, its founder, an ideologue named Abu al-Maududi, considered himself, ideologically very close to Qutb and to al-Banna. So Jamaat al-Islami is the main Islamist movement within South Asia. It's particularly prominent in Pakistan and India. In 1971, during Bangladesh's liberation war, in which Bangladesh fought to become its own country and no longer, as it was called then, East Pakistan, it fought its Pakistani oppressors and freed itself, created a new country. In the process of that war, Jamaat al-Islami, working with Pakistani forces, slaughtered, mass murdered thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of Bangladeshis. And after the war, its leaders fled to the West. where they set up community institutions, including a very prominent American Muslim organization called the Islamic Circle of North America. One of their directors, their presidents, was a man called Ashfuz Rahman Khan, who has been convicted in absentia since then, just a few years ago, for his role in the mass murder of 18 Bangladeshis in 1971. He was part of a killing squad. In fact, he led a killing squad. This is true all across the West. You'll find these war criminals living now in the West and running Islamist institutions that pose as ordinary community groups in Western countries. So last week, we had a piece in the National Review looking at the Islamic Circle of North America, this Jamaat al-Islami group, looking at one of its sister organizations, a charity, an aid charity called called Helping Hand for Relief and Development. And we found that they are openly working with terrorist organizations in Pakistan, including Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a very prominent Pakistani terrorist group that was behind the Mumbai attacks in 2008. You might remember those. They're working with Jamaat al-Islami organizations in Pakistan, such as the Al-Khidmat Foundation, which openly funds Hamas and other terrorist organizations. And they are raising money in America and taking it to Pakistan, taking it to groups that are killing and murdering in Kashmir and India and Pakistan and elsewhere. This is happening under our noses. Now, because there has been a focus on the Muslim Brotherhood in America over the last 10, 20 years, and rightly so, they're a dangerous group, but Islamist Watch works on the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood is just one of many problematic and dangerous networks and sects that we need to tackle. And we don't solely focus on the Brotherhood, and we think solely focusing on the Brotherhood risks ignoring or failing to note the danger of those other networks. And Jamaat al-Islami is a very large network with a very large presence in the United States. And I'm afraid to say that some of the money it raises here comes directly from the US taxpayer through USAID grants, through Department for Homeland Security grants. This is a dangerous network, and we have to start tackling it now.
Well, it's a good thing that you're bringing that up to our audience. That is a group that we don't talk about as much here on ABN's Trinity channel, but it's a group that we should probably start focusing on as well. I'll definitely continue to keep an eye on Islamist Watch and Middle East Forum as I get the Islam in the News stories ready each week. And we've done some stories on the UK in general. A couple of years ago, I did the Islamization of the United Kingdom with Tommy Robinson during one of our international apologetics marathons. We look to the UK. I tell people all the time, America needs to look to the UK because we're either going to we can either follow their mistakes and follow in their footsteps, or we need to learn from their mistakes and not make those same mistakes ourselves. But you were from the UK. What differences have you seen between Islamism there and Islamism in the US? What can we learn from the UK's battle with Islamism, and perhaps what can the UK learn from the US and what we are actually still doing that they're not?
That's an interesting question, and it has a lot of answers. I think of the most important I can talk about here is when it comes to the folly of government trying to tackle this problem. Back in the mid 2000s, the Labour Party was in power, and it decided to tackle the problem of radicalization and terrorism by giving money to the non-violent, the lawful Islamists who ran the community institutions. It gave millions and millions and millions of dollars to extremists to fight extremism. Now, at the time, colleagues of mine, moderate Muslim activists, said, this is madness. You should not be doing this. They did it anyway, and surprise, surprise, radicalization didn't stop. In fact, it got worse, and more and more extremism was found being preached in mosques, this time thanks to the help of the British government and the money it was distributing. So in 2010, 2011, the British government, now under a Conservative leader, David Cameron, realized this had been a huge mistake, and they stopped this. And it was a very important thing to do. You fast forward a few years to America, the last few years of the Obama administration, and they set up the CVE program, the Countering Violent Extremism program. And what do? They have a big White House summit where they invite Muslim Brotherhood organizations from across the country to come and talk about how to tackle extremism. About a year later, just again, last moments of the Obama administration, these grants were announced, and in there was included a number of Islamist organizations. The Obama administration wanted to do exactly what the British government had done and so thoroughly regretted: give money to the extremists to fight extremism. Thankfully, those grants have been cancelled under the Trump administration. But the current government could do a lot to learn from the mistakes that Europe has made in trying to tackle this problem. I often say when I speak to people about this subject that America is sort of 10 years behind Europe. It can look to Europe, see what's happening with regards to Islamization, with regards to extremism and counter-extremism efforts, and see what worked and see what didn't, and then make the right choice. And I think America does need to do that, because America is better off than Europe is right now by a long shot. You have more moderate Muslims, you have more moderate Muslim groups, and you have more people who are tuned into this issue. America must act before it becomes like Europe and extremists run the streets.
And unfortunately, there are many people here in the U.S. who have no idea what is happening in the UK currently or what has happened there over the last 10, 15, 20 years. We continually try to let people know about it and say, hey, watch these videos to see what it's like in the UK. If you go outside the tourist areas, you need to, see what's going on in many of the territories that have had a lot of immigration, and even to see technically the small percentage of Muslims in the UK and yet what it's like. And again, this is one more thing that lines up with the life of Muhammad, is as he had more followers and became more powerful, then the commands to everyone began to change. And this is something that we've seen throughout history over and over and over again. Now, in the UK, throughout Europe, and of course in the United States as well, there are liberal activists and there are also conservatives. So how do both of those groups, what do they get wrong about Islamism and Islamists, whether they are in the UK or whether they are in the United States?
Well, the problem is broadly the same in both Europe and America. The liberals, as you call them, the left, deny the problem of radical Islam. They deny that Islamism is a thing. They'll admit that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS exist, but I think, as you mentioned earlier in the show, they'll suggest there's nothing Islamic about them, which is self-evidently preposterous. The right, meanwhile, sometimes they're very tuned into this issue, but I'm afraid there's also similar sentiments expressed by the right. They think it's a distraction from real issues, or they agree with the left that there's nothing Islamic about it. That's more of a European problem. The right in America is a little more sensible about the threat and has done some good things in raising awareness and trying to fight back against this problem. I will say this, and by the way, it's telling that we're having this conversation on your show and not in mainstream media, because the mainstream media won't discuss this topic so openly as we are today, and that's great. I think this conversation needs to be had. And I think the benefit of having this conversation is that we can disagree slightly over some of our interpretations of this problem. And one of those is that I personally don't think that Islam is intrinsically extreme or intrinsically violent. I think it's easy to hijack, and I think there are extremists who have innovated parts of within Islam to create Islamism. So within the right, there is this disagreement too, of course. Those who feel that Islam is inherently problematic, and those who feel that it is prone to be problematic, and a moderate strain can emerge. That said, regardless of all of that, I think there is a huge problem in America of not enough on the left even willing to admit that there is a problem. And one of the great things about Europe is that you have this old liberalism, this sort of classic liberalism in Europe, this sort of 1960s left-wing idea that free speech, free expression is sacrosanct. And they see Islamism for what it is, a threat to free speech, a threat to free expression, a threat to safety, a threat to equality and minority rights. These are left-wingers who are sticking with their original left-wing ideals. They say, if we believe in these values, we must defend them, even if it's under attack by another minority. We will still say this is wrong. That does not seem to exist in America right now. There does not seem to be an element within the left who say, we call ourselves liberals. Why are we not challenging this incredibly illiberal behavior by radical Islam? We call ourselves Democrats. Why are we not fighting to preserve our democracy from these extremely undemocratic ideologues and their violent agenda? This is missing from the American left. And I think until it creates itself, until it emerges, fighting radical Islam will be very hard in America, because it will be a right-wing issue. And if it's just a right-wing issue, it's a partisan issue, and it makes it almost impossible to get done.
Now, one of the main groups that we need to think about and look to and help educate is the youth, the people who may be running not only the United States, but also European nations within the next 10 to 15 years. People who are going to be growing up and moving into different jobs within the government and all of that. We need to get them educated, because they really are the future of these two Western areas. So how can we talk to the youth about the state of the world, and how concerned should we be about their education outside of the home?
It's very easy with the mad opposition to free speech that you see on campuses, especially in both Europe and America. It's very easy to be depressed about the next generation of youth. And every now and again, I do have to remind myself that the problems within the upcoming generation are, in fact, most likely a minority. And the vast majority of, say, students on campus don't fall in line with this mad censorship and gender politics and identities that you see now sort of running the conversation. I think it's important to remember the vast majority of people will respond positively to rational conversation and debate. And so the best thing we could do, I think, with the next generation, especially when it comes to the question of radical Islam, is to be rational about them, to present it with the facts. Now, so often, both the left and sometimes the right, I'm afraid, obfuscates the facts by falling back to dogma. And I think our job, especially at the Middle East Forum, is to find the facts and to disseminate them, is to research the truth and to put it out. And working with channels like yours and moderate Muslims, allies, and groups from both the left and the right, if we push the truth out, if we provide the research, if we allow people to look into things for themselves, free of some partisan dogma, then I think the next generation will make the right decision. But it would be a lot easier if some of the left decided to come on board with this fight and stop their blanket denials.
Well, I think that is happening more and more, as people who do fall into that left category are getting more educated about this topic. They're realizing that not only the jihadists, but also even the political Islamists are not an aberration of Islam. And dealing with Muslims who are living today. We can't do anything about the past. We can't change the past. Good thing that we have historical books to let us know about the history of Islam and all of that. And at the same time, we want to have that in the back of our minds as we reach out to work with our Muslim neighbors. And just, if nothing else, be aware of the agenda for the West. And again, there are many moderate Muslims who don't even have anything to do with this, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the political Islamists, the guys who were in charge of this, would still like to use the moderate Muslims out there as part of the worldwide ummah for their agenda. And as we see in the East, when someone leaves Islam or even criticizes Islam, that does not have a good result for that individual. And here in the West, thankfully, it's not that way. This is the time for people to realize that Islam is a lie and leave it, or at least think about how it can modernize and coexist with other religions that are in opposition to it. Now, you are the director of Islamist Watch, which is a project of the Middle East Forum. How can viewers get involved with the forum's work, and what does a membership look like?
Well, we welcome all the support we can get. You can sign up for our emails, our reports, our briefings. That's free. Go to our website, meforum.org, and you can sign up there. You can donate to the forum, and for a small amount, under $100, you can have access to special briefings, phone calls, meetings and events with the experts at the forum. I would recommend you do this. We're looking into areas of Middle East policy, of Islamism, with regards to Israel, to Iran, to Turkey and Qatar, that you won't get anywhere else. So I would recommend you sign up at our website and donate if you can, and read what we have to offer.
And we definitely want to point people to those two websites. Again, they are on the bottom of your screen, meforum.org, and also Islamist-watch.org. Make sure you have the dash in between those two words there, or you might not end up where you want to go. But definitely a couple sites for people to check out. Again, every single week they are posting new articles by a number of different authors. It's not like there's just one person who's doing all the writing here. They're kind of like an editor of the website, just like you see a book where it's all on the same topic, but many different contributors. And that's the same case with these websites, where they have a lot of great information by different people. Some of those people have been featured here on the Trinity channel before, others haven't, but there's always more shows to have them on as well. Now, Sam, what are now that we're in 2018, what are some of the top projects that you guys are working on? Perhaps things that a lot of viewers don't know about, they haven't heard about it, you guys haven't posted them on the website yet. But what can we anticipate from Islamist Watch and Middle East Forum at that in 2018?
Well, I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of Islamist sects that people don't know about and that we don't know about either. And we're looking into them, we're researching, we're producing information. So in 2018, look for primers and new research on Islamist networks operating in America, unknown to journalists, to politicians, to even to academics. We're looking at the scope and influence and extent of these networks and seeing just how much damage they're doing. So look out for that. Look out for our work on Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member and yet openly funding terrorism, attacking allies, especially among the Kurds. Look out for our work on Turkey and its sponsorship of Islamism in the West. And look out for our work on terror finance. We're looking, especially when taxpayers' money is involved, we're looking at Islamist charities, 501c3s in the US, often that receive grants from government, who are using that money to promote extremism at home and terror abroad.
And that is one more country that people need to look to as well. And it's very good to hear that you're doing work on Turkey and Erdogan, because that is something that is kind of new for a lot of people. Erdogan and Turkey are in the news more and more today. Recently did a show on Colliding Worldviews talking about that, and even in Islam in the News talking about that all the time, it seems, with the different news stories that get put out. But even with Erdogan, who I actually showed a picture recently of him next to Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's pretty much the modern day Said Qutb, or Qaradawi is the modern day theologian of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this news story was that Muslim scholars worldwide name Erdogan as kind of the guy to look to. It's almost like, he's the caliph, quote unquote, that they're looking to kind of be the head of Islamism throughout the world, in a sense. And even to see the battle that's going on between Erdogan and Fethullah Gulen. I'm not sure how much work you guys have done on the Gulen movement that is here in the West, charter schools, believe it or not, that are throughout the United States, and how he and Erdogan, Fethullah Gulen and Erdogan, were very close up to, I believe, about 2013 when there was a falling away. And now Erdogan calling Gulen and his movement a terrorist organization and all of that. Very interesting dynamic, because, once again, two groups from the same country, Erdogan and Gulen, one considering the other terrorist, quote unquote, both wanting the Islamization of the world, but again, different ways in going about it. And of course, both wanting to be the top dog there. So very important for people to continue to look to Turkey and what's going on there. Now, Sam, we're going to continue to point people to your website to read the different articles and stuff that you guys have. Of course, some people want to just go out and buy books, though, that talk about all of this. If you could recommend one or two or three books to our viewers who might just want to get more and supplement that to the articles that you guys put out, what books would you recommend for people to pick up?
Well, first of all, it would be remiss of me not to say go to the Middle East Forum website, look at the books we review regularly, read the books by our fellows, by our president, Dr. Daniel Pipes. There's a lot of information there you will not regret learning. If you're asking for books on Islamism, particularly, I recommend a book. It's about Islamism in Britain, actually, but it's the best summary of all the different Islamist networks that operate in the West that I've certainly read. And it's by a BBC journalist, of all people, called Inez Bowen. And it's called, I believe, from Medina to Najaf. A Tale of British Islam. I may have got the title slightly wrong, but if you search on Google along those lines, you'll find it. It is a summary. Each chapter is a summary of a different Islamist network that operates in Britain. Those networks that operate in Britain are also operating here in the US. So if you want to understand the differences between key Islamist networks in the West, I very much recommend this book.
And that is a great recommendation for our viewers. Again, trying to get people educated about the political Islamists in the West, in the distinction between them, the method of operation that they have versus the jihadists out there who, again, have the same worldview overall, the same end goal, but different ways of going about it. And again, the jihadists are a huge distraction from the political Islamists who are working behind the scenes, building the relationships, reaching out to, again, government officials, law enforcement, religious leaders. Sam, we talk about all the time the interfaith dialogues, quote unquote, that happen here in the U.S., where it's always a Muslim, and then you have usually a liberal Jew, and then you have a Christian, quote unquote, which is commonly a pastor from like a Unitarian Universalist church or something like that, someone who doesn't even hold Orthodox Christian theology. And it's never a really debate. It's always a we all agree that Islam isn't so bad, or we all agree that Islam's a good thing, or whatever. That is something else that's happening here. There's a book I've mentioned before that was published in 1989 called The Methodology of Dawah. And if you look at CARE and different Muslim Brotherhood front groups, they are just following that to a T, because that gives a list of things for Islamists to do in the West to make Islam palatable, acceptable, and all of that. And it's quite interesting how you only see these political Islamists working hard in countries that currently are not under Sharia. And those who are under Sharia, there's no reason for them to work because the agenda has already been met. So very important information. And Sam, it's been a huge blessing to have you here on Colliding Worldviews to talk about this very timely topic that many people need to get educated about. I hope that you continue the great work that you are doing, that you guys continue to put out great articles, and we're going to continue to point our viewers to those as well. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Friends, we need to continue to think about all of this and educate those who are not aware of Islam, the religio-political system that sets it apart from the different man-made religions out there. And of course, the huge distinctions between all of those, but particularly Islam, compared to Christianity. Again, we use many of the same terms, but we're also using different dictionaries. And people need to be educated about the terms that are used by political Islamists that sound similar to the words that we use here in the West. But again, if they're not defined, we continue to talk past one another, and that does us no good. So continue to help other people get educated. Take this video and share it with others to help them know what they need to know. And we will see you next Monday for another episode of Colliding Worldviews right here on ABN's Trinity channel.